In the golden expanse of Wyoming's wilderness, a freight train screeches to an unexpected halt. Engineer Jonathan Reed stares in disbelief at the impossible sight. Before him, a herd of wild Mustangs deliberately blocking the tracks, their magnificent leader pouring the ground in silent defiance. As Jonathan approaches the Mustangs, parts slightly not to flee, but to reveal what they're protecting in the tall grass beside the railway. What these creatures are guarding will shake the foundations of Blue Mesa and pit Jonathan against the most powerful forces in the county. This is a story of how a routine delivery became a battle for survival, of unlikely alliances between man and nature, and of a secret some would kill to keep hidden a truth worth stopping a train for. Before we jump back and tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun casts long shadows across the Blue Mesa train art as Jonathan Reed sipped his lukewarm coffee. 15 years on this route had taught him to appreciate these quiet moments before the day's journey began at 43. The weathered lines around his eyes told stories of countless miles across the Wyoming wilderness through blizzards and summer heat waves alike. "You're here early?" Martha Jenkins called from the dispatch office window. Her silver hair was pulled back in its usual tight bun, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose, eager to get going or trouble at home. Jonathan shrugged his smile, not quite reaching his eyes' grace. "Is visiting this weekend. Thought I'd take an early run, so I can clean up the place before she arrives." Martha nodded. Knowingly, Jonathan's relationship with his 16-year-old daughter had been strained since the divorce 3 years ago. Every visit felt like navigating uncharted territory. She's still into photography, seems that way, talking about studying environmental science in college. Now, too, pride mixed with something like worry crossed his face. Not much money in either, but she's got passion. The sound of boots on gravel announced Anna Hernandez's arrival at 32. She was one of the youngest conductors on the route, but what she lacked in years, she made up for in precision and attention to detail. "Morning, Reed," she said, holding up a paper bag. "Bro, Martha told me you've been living on coffee and regret." Jonathan accepted the bag, peering inside to find a breakfast burrito. "You're a lifesaver." "Hernandez, what's our cargo today?" Anna asked, pulling her dark hair into a ponytail and securing her uniform cap. Martha slid a clipboard across her desk. "Machinery parts for the Cooper mine, plus the usual supplies for the outlying ranches. Should be a standard run." Jonathan reviewed the manifest, noting the weight distribution and estimated arrival times. "We're carrying some equipment for Westridge Mining too." "I see." Martha's expression tightened slightly. "Lawrence Whitney called 3 times yesterday to make sure his precious cargo gets priority unloading at Blue Mesa Station. Whitney could buy his own train with what he makes in a month." Anna muttered, "But heaven forbid his mining equipment is delayed by 20 minutes. Jonathan said nothing, but the mention of Westridge Mining left a sour taste in his mouth. The company had expanded aggressively in the last 5 years. Their operations, spreading across previously untouched wilderness, Grace had sent him articles about their environmental record. Not good, but jobs were jobs in this economy, in Blue Mesa needed them. 40 minutes later, the freight train rumbled to life beneath Jonathan's experienced hands. The massive diesel engine responded to his touch like an old friend, the familiar vibrations traveling up through his boots as they pulled away from the yard. 16 cars of machinery, construction materials, and ranch supplies stretched out behind them as they began their journey across the high plains. The landscape opened up around them as they left the small town behind. Mile after mile of golden prairie stretched to the horizon, broken occasionally by rocky outcroppings and clusters of pine. This was why Jonathan had never transferred to a more urban route out here. He could breathe the endless sky above, the rhythm of the tracks below, and nothing but open country in between. Anna returned from checking the coupling on one of the rear cars, sliding into the seat beside him in the locomotive cabin. "All secure back there," she reported, making a notation on her tablet. "Though I notice the Westridge cargo isn't properly marked, just says industrial equipment." Jonathan shrugged. "Probably more drilling gear. They're tearing up half the county looking for minerals. My cousin works for them," Anna said, gazing out at the passing landscape. "Says they're offering double wages for night shift. Now people are lining up for jobs. Can't blame them." Jonathan replied, "Not many options in Blue Mesa these days." The train rounded a gentle curve, beginning its approach to Eagle Pass, where the tracks threaded between 2 steep hills. The path narrowed here, with the rails hugging the contours of the land. Jonathan eased back on the throttle, following standard protocol for this section. "We're making good time," Anna noted, checking her watch ahead of schedule by about 10 minutes. Jonathan nodded, his eyes fixed on the tracks. Ahead, the morning light caught something in the distance, a glint of movement that seemed out of place. He squinted, then felt his heart skip a beat. "Anna," he said his voice suddenly tense. "Look ahead, quarter mile or so." Anna leaned forward, peering through the windshield. What the hell? Across the tracks, perhaps 400 yards ahead, stood a line of horses, not just one or two strays, but at least 15 wild Mustangs standing directly on a railway line, their bodies forming a living barricade in the path of the oncoming train. "They're not moving," Anna said, disbelief evident in her voice. Jonathan immediately reduced speed, his mind racing to make sense of what he was seeing. In all his years on this route, he'd occasionally spotted wild horses in the distance, but they always scattered long. Before the train approached, this was different, deliberate, almost. "I'm calling it in," Anna said, reaching for the radio as she reported the unusual obstacle. To dispatch Jonathan continued to slow the train, the massive machine protesting as the brakes gripped the wheels. They were close enough now to see the Mustangs. Clearly at the center stood a magnificent Palomino stallion, his golden coat gleaming in the morning sun. The animal's head was high, ears forward, body tense, but not frightened. Flanking him were horses of various colors, bay ran dun, all standing with the same unusual stillness. "Martha says to use the horn," Anna reported after the brief radio exchange. "Try to scare them off." Jonathan nodded and sounded the train's horn, a long, piercing blast that echoed across the prairie. The horses' ears flattened against their heads, but to his astonishment, not a single animal bolted. The Palomino leader even poured the ground as if in defiance. "This isn't normal," Jonathan muttered, applying the emergency brake system. The train shuddered as momentum fought against the sudden deceleration, the screech of metal against metal filling the air as they braced themselves against the control panel. The train ground to a complete stop just 50 yards from a horsesack. In the sudden silence that followed, Jonathan and Anna exchanged bewildered glances. "Protocol for wildlife on the tracks is clear," Anna said, reaching for the manual. "Use the horn." "Which we did. If they don't move, proceed with caution." At reduced speed, Jonathan shook his head. "We're not plowing through a herd of Mustangs." "I'm not suggesting that," Anna replied, her dark eyes wide. "But this isn't horses. Don't do this. They don't stand in formation on train tracks." Jonathan unbuckled his safety harness. "I'm going to take a look." "Are you serious?" Anna protested. "Those are wild Mustangs, not pets. Something's not right here," Jonathan insisted, pulling on his work gloves. "Keep the engine running and stay on the radio. If anything happens, call for help." Before Anna could argue further, Jonathan stepped out onto the small platform at the front of the locomotive and made his way down the metal ladder to the ground. The summer heat hit him. Immediately the air dry, and still his boots crunched on the gravel beside the tracks. As he took a few cautious steps forward from ground level, the Mustang seemed much larger. Their presence more imposing. The Palomino stallion, clearly the leader, stood slightly ahead of the others, his intelligent eyes fixed on Jonathan. The horse's muscles rippled beneath his golden coat. Power and grace contained in perfect balance. "What are you doing here?" Jonathan found himself asking aloud, his voice sounding strange in the open air. The stallion snorted, pouring to ground again. Then, remarkably, the horse took several steps to the side, as if responding to some silent command. The other horses also began to move, not away from the tracks, but creating an opening in their formation. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat as he saw what lay beyond the tall grass beside the railway line. Was a small pond, more a large puddle, really fed by a natural spring that bubbled up from between the rocks. Beside this pool lay a Mustang, and for its small body, unnaturally still, its cream-colored coat marred by disturbing foam around its muzzle. "Oh my God," Jonathan whispered, taking another step forward. The Palomino stallion watched him intently, but made no move to charge or flee. The other horses maintained their positions, creating a protective semicircle around the fallen. Jonathan heard the locomotive door open and close behind him, followed by the sound of footsteps on gravel. "I couldn't just sit there," Anna explained as she came to stand beside him. Then she spotted what Jonathan was looking at. Is it dead?" "I don't know," Jonathan answered, his voice tight. He pulled out his radio and made another call to dispatch, explaining the situation and requesting assistance. "Martha says the nearest wildlife officer is at least an hour away," he reported after ending the call. "But that FO doesn't look good." Anna looked uneasily at the Mustangs. "Why would they bring us to Sickle? How would they even know to stop a train?" Jonathan studied the scene more carefully, his eyes drawn to the small spring pool where the FO had apparently collapsed. Something about the water caught his attention, an unnatural sheen on its surface, a strange odor that reached him even from this distance. "I don't think it's just a sicko," he said slowly. "Look at the water. That doesn't look right on us, squinted against the sun. It looks oily, chemical, Maybe Jonathan took a careful step closer to the spring the Palomino stallion watched, but allowed his approach to water had a sickly bluish tinge and smelled faintly of sulfur and something. Oh, something industrial this water's contaminated, Jonathan said with growing certainty. And these horses, he gestured to the Mustang, heard they brought us here to show us. Anna's expression was skeptical. That's a pretty big assumption, Reed. They're wild animals. Not I know how it sounds, Jonathan interrupted. But look at them. They're not acting like wild animals. They stop a train for God's sake. And now they're showing us their sick FO and this contaminated. Spring as if to confirm his words, the Palomino stallion approached the spring and nudged the foal gently with his muzzle, then raised his head to look directly at Jonathan's eyes, filled with what almost seemed like a plea for help. We've got to do something. Jonathan decided that Evo needs help, and someone needs to know about this water. If it's contaminated, it could affect the whole watershed. Anna hesitated, then nodded. I'll call Martha again, see if she can get hold of Dr. Meyer at the Wildlife Center. He'll know what to do for the FO. As Anna made the call, Jonathan cautiously approached the fallen. Oh. The Mustang shifted nervously, but allowed him to come closer under the watchful eye of their leader. Up close, the foe's condition was even more alarming. Its breathing was shallow, its small body trembling with each labored breath clear. Signs of poisoning. Jonathan knelt beside the young horse, gently stroking its neck. Hang in there, little one, he murmured. Help is coming. The Palomino stallion stood nearby, watching the strange human touch one of his herd. There was an intelligence in those eyes that Jonathan couldn't explain, awareness that went beyond normal animal instinct. It's like they know, Jonathan said. When Anna rejoined him, like they understand what's happening here, Dr. Meyer is on his way with his assistant, Anna reported, and Sheriff Patterson, 2 Marthas, also notified the environmental agency about the water. Jonathan nodded, his gaze traveling up the small stream that fed the spring. It originated from somewhere in the hills beyond hills where Westridge Mining had recently expanded their operations. Westridge, he said quietly, their new dig site is just over that ridge. Anna followed his gaze, understanding dawning on her face. You think their mining operation is leaking into the groundwater? I think, Jonathan said carefully, that these horses just stopped the train, show us something that could shut down a multi-million-dollar company. The implications hung in the air between them as they waited with the Mustangs under the vast Wyoming sky, the freight train silent on the tracks, the FO fighting for his life beside the poisoned spring, and the Palomino stallion standing guard over them, all sentinels of the wild caught between nature and the relentless march of progress telling. And preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoyed, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story, The Wait for Help. Stretched longer than expected, Jonathan sat on a rock near the fallen FO, keeping a respectful distance while still monitoring its condition. The young horse's breathing had grown more labored each inhale, a visible struggle that made Jonathan's chest tighten with concern, and a pace nearby, occasionally checking in with dispatch on her radio. The Mustang herd maintained their vigil, some grazing cautiously on the dry summer grass, while others stood alert, their ears swiveling to catch every sound. The Palomino stallion, Jonathan had started thinking of him as renegade in his mind, remained closest to the FO, occasionally nudging it gently or standing between it and the humans. How's it doing? Anna asked, coming to stand beside Jonathan. Not a good. He answered honestly, whatever's in that water, it's hit the little one hard. INA's gaze drifted to the contaminated spring. I took some photos and sent them to Martha. She's forwarding them to the environmental agency. The sound of approaching vehicles broke the stillness. 2 dust clouds appeared on the service road that paralleled the tracks about half a mile back. A white pickup truck with government markings and an older model Jeep. The Mustangs grew alert, several moving protectively closer to the FO. Easy, Jonathan said, not sure if he was talking to the horses or himself. Help's coming. As the vehicles pulled up and parked, Renegade poured the ground nervously, but held his position. The pickup's door opened, and a tall man in his 50s stepped out, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He wore khaki pants and a field vest over a button-up shirt, a wide-brimmed hat shading his face from the summer sun. Darmir and greeted her with obvious relief. Dr. Douglas Meyer nodded in acknowledgement, his eyes already assessing the situation with professional focus. A younger woman emerged from the passenger side, carrying a large medical case. This is my assistant, Jessica. Darmir introduced her briefly before turning his attention to Mustangs. How long has the FO been down? No idea, Jonathan admitted. We found it like this when the horses stopped our train. They what? Jessica asked, her eyebrows rising in surprise. Stood right on the tracks. Anna confirmed, wouldn't move even when we sounded the horn from the Jeep emerged. An older man in a sheriff's uniform, his weathered face creased with concern beneath the gray mustache. Sheriff Lloyd Patterson adjusted his hat. As he approached, nodding to Jonathan and Anna Martha, "Fill me in," he said, his voice growly from years of Wyoming winters. Said, "You got Mustangs playing crossing guard and a poisoned water source. See for yourself." Jonathan gestured to the spring where a bluish film was clearly visible on the surface. Dr. Meyer had already begun a careful approach toward the FO, speaking in low, soothing tones. To everyone's surprise, Renegade stepped back, allowing the wildlife biologist access to the suffering young horse Jessica, followed with the medical kit moving with the same measured caution. "Remarkable," Dr. Meyer murmured as he knelt beside the FO. "The herd's behavior is extraordinarily protective, but they're accepting our help." Sheriff Patterson joined Jonathan by the spring, squatting down to examine the contaminated water. "More closely, I've seen this before," he said grimly. "Up by the North Ridge, last year mining runoff has a particular smell to it." Westridge Jonathan asked the sheriff's expression, hardened their new operation. "Is just over that hill." They swore up and down. They had containment measures in place. He straightened up with a grunt guess. "Those measures aren't working so well." Dr. Meyer was performing a swift examination of the FO, his experienced hands moving with gentle efficiency over the young animal's body. Jessica assisted preparing medications and handing him instruments from the case toxicity. Dr. Meyer confirmed, "After a few minutes consistent with heavy metal poisoning, we need to get fluids started immediately and begin chelation therapy." "Will it survive?" Jonathan asked, unable to keep the concern from his voice. Dr. Meyer's expression was guarded hard to say, "Depends how much contaminated water it drank and how long ago." The fact that it's still alive is promising. As they worked, Sheriff Patterson walked the perimeter of the small spring, following the trickle of water uphill toward its source. "Looks like it's coming from that direction," he called, pointing toward a rocky outcropping that partially hid the Westridge mining operation beyond. Anna had been taking photographs of the scene with her phone. "Should we be collecting samples or something?" she asked, already on it. Jessica responded, holding up several vials she'd filled with the tainted water. "We'll get these to the lab right away." The FO stirred as Dr. Meyer administered an injection. A weak wicker escaping its muzzle. Renegade responded immediately with a soft, nickering sound, stepping closer to nuzzle the young horse. "I've never seen anything like this," Dr. Meyer said quietly, this level of coordinated protective behavior in wild Mustangs, it's unprecedented. They stopped to train. Jonathan reminded him, stood right on the tracks until we hit the emergency brakes. Dr. Meyer shook his head in amazement. "Extraordinary, almost as if they understood the danger and knew they needed human intervention." "Can we move the FO?" Jessica asked. "It needs intensive care." "That's a challenge," Dr. Meyer replied. "Moving it risks further stress. But leaving it here," he glanced at the contaminated spring. Sheriff Patterson rejoined them, his expression grim. "I put in a call to the Environmental Protection Office. They're sending someone out, but it'll be tomorrow at the earliest." "Tomorrow," Anna protested. "What about the water contamination happening right now?" "Welcome to rural Wyoming," the sheriff replied with a hint of bitterness. "We don't exactly get priority." Response. Jonathan had been watching the Palomino stallion, struck by the intelligence in the animal's eyes. "What about the rest of the herd?" "They can't stay here drinking poisoned water. They seem aware of the danger." Dr. Meyer observed. "Notice how none of them are approaching the spring. They're drinking from that creek over there. Instead," he nodded toward a small stream about 50 yards away that flowed from a different direction. "Smart horses," Sheriff Patterson muttered. "I need to get this train moving." Anna said reluctantly, "We're already hours behind schedule, and dispatch is getting antsy." Jonathan felt torn. The thought of simply leaving the Mustangs and continuing on his route felt wrong. Somehow, as if he'd be betraying a trust, yet he knew the railroad wouldn't accept wild horses and needed my help as an excuse for further delays. "Go," Dr. Meyer said, seeming to sense his dilemma. "We've got things under control here, Jessica, and I will stay with the FO until we can safely transport it to our facility." Sheriff Patterson nodded agreement. "I'll stick around too, make sure nobody from Westridge comes poking around before the environmental boys get here." Jonathan hesitated, then approached Renegade. Slowly, the stallion watched him wearily, but didn't retreat. "We'll be back," Jonathan said quietly, feeling slightly foolish talking to a horse, yet somehow certain the animal understood him on some level. "These people will help your folk." Renegade snorted softly, his intelligent eyes fixed on Jonathan's. Then, with a toss of his magnificent head, the stallion stepped back, allowing Jonathan a clear path to return to the train. As Jonathan and Anna walked back to the locomotive, she glanced at him sideways. "You know Lawrence Whitney is going to hear about this delay, right? He's probably already breathing down Martha's neck about his precious cargo." Jonathan Grimace Whitney was a powerful man in Blue Mesa, his mining operation, the largest employer in the county, Let him some things are more important than schedule adherence, says the man who's never been late in 15 years and a tease, then grew serious. You think that F.O. will make it? I hope so. Jonathan replied, climbing back up the ladder to the engine. Cabin those horses went to extraordinary lengths to save it. The train resumed its journey 30 minutes later, moving carefully past the Mustang, heard several of the horses, including Renegade, stood watching as the massive machine rumbled by. Jonathan could have sworn the Palomino stallion nodded him as they passed. As predicted, Lawrence Whitney was waiting at the Blue Mesa station. When they finally arrived, his expensive suit, looking out of place against the weathered wooden platform at 53 Whitney, had the polished appearance of someone who spent more time in boardrooms than the Wyoming wilderness, despite having built his fortune on exploiting that very land 4 hours late. Reed, Whitney said by way of greeting, checking his gold watch. Pointedly care to explain why my equipment is arriving behind schedule. Jonathan stepped down from the locomotive, meeting Whitney's cold gaze directly. Wildlife emergency on the track, sir. Unavoidable delay. Wildlife emergency. Whitney repeated his tone, making it clear how little he thought of such an excuse. You stopped a freight train for some animals' contaminated water source. Jonathan replied evenly, and yes, endangered wild mustangs. Sheriff Patterson and D.R. Meir from Wildlife Services are still out. There, you might want to give him a call. Something flickered across Whitney's face, concern perhaps, or calculation. What exactly are you implying, Reed? Not implying anything, sir. Just reporting the facts. We found a poison spring near Eagle Pass. The sheriff seemed to think it might be coming from a mining operation in the area. Whitney's expression hardened. Natural minerals in the soil can affect water quality, Reed. That's why we have extensive environmental protocols in place. He straightened his tie. Next time, consider the economic impact before you delay an entire freight shipment for a horse with stomach ache. It was a F.O., Sir. Jonathan corrected him, quietly dying from what looked an awful lot like chemical poisoning. Whitney stared at him for a long moment, then turned on his heel. I'll be speaking with your supervisor, he called over his shoulder as he strode toward his waiting Range Rover. Anna appeared at Jonathan's side, watching Whitney's departure. That went well, she remarked, dryly, about as expected. Jonathan agreed. He checked his watch. Still enough time to get home and clean up before Grace arrived for the weekend, yet he couldn't shake the image of the struggling foe from his mind, or the intelligent eyes of the Palomino stallion, who had trusted him enough to ask for help. You heading home? Anna asked. Yeah, Grace is coming for the weekend. Jonathan hesitated. I might take her out to Dr. Meir's Wildlife Center tomorrow. She loves photography, and I'd like to check on that F.O. Anna smiled, always a softy beneath that gruff engineer exterior. She punched his arm lightly. Say hi to Grace for me. And Reed, she added as he turned to go, what you did today was the right thing no matter what Whitney says. Jonathan nodded his thanks and headed for his truck, his thoughts split between the upcoming visit with his daughter and the extraordinary encounter on the track. Something told him this wasn't over, that the Mustangs had brought him into something bigger than a single poison spring or a sick F.O. As he drove through town, he noticed a gathering crowd outside the local diner, unusual for a Thursday afternoon. He slowed down, rolling down his window to call to Olivia Ramirez, the diner's owner, who was standing on the sidewalk. What's going on, Olivia? She hurried over, her expression troubled. You haven't heard? 3 kids in the high school are in the hospital. They were swimming in Miller's Creek yesterday, same one that runs down from where Westridge is digging. All 3 got sick within hours. Jonathan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning in his truck. How bad? Bad enough that they've been airlifted to the regional hospital. Olivia replied grimly. Doctor says it looks like chemical exposure of some kind. As Jonathan drove away, the pieces began to connect in his mind. The contaminated spring where the Mustangs had led him wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern, a warning sign of something much more dangerous spreading through the waterways of Blue Mesa County. And somehow, impossibly, the wild Mustangs had known they had stopped a train to sound an alarm that no one else had noticed until now. The question was, what was he going to do about it? Jonathan's small ranch house on the outskirts of Blue Mesa had never felt so empty as it did when he was preparing for Grace's visits. The place wasn't much. 3 bedrooms, a modest kitchen, and a living room with windows that faced the distant mountains. But it had been their family home before the divorce. Now, with just him rattling around in it, the silence seemed to magnify the absence of what once was. He was straightening the guest room, Grace's old room, though he never called it that anymore, when he heard the crunch of tires on the gravel. Driveway his heart did that familiar skip it always did when his daughter came home to window. He watched as his ex-wife's SUV pulled up and Grace emerged, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, a camera bag slung over one shoulder. Jonathan met them at the door, doing his best to keep his smile natural, not forced. "Hey, kiddo." Grace gave him a quick hug. "Hi, Dad." Rebecca, his ex-wife, stayed by the car, her arms crossed. They'd been civil since the divorce, but the warmth was long gone. She needs to be back Sunday by 6. She calls. She has a big biology test Monday. I remember Jonathan assured her he'd written it on his calendar weeks ago, along with every other detail Grace had mentioned during their phone calls. "Drive safe, Rebecca." Nodded, gave Grace a wave, and drove away, leaving father and daughter standing awkwardly in the doorway. "How was the drive?" Jonathan asked, taking Grace's backpack. Fine. Grace stepped inside, her eyes scanning the living room, as if checking for changes. "Mom said you had some excitement at work today." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "News travels fast, small town." Grace shrugged. "Plus, everyone's talking about those kids who got sick." Mom said your train got stopped by some wild horses near where it happened." Jonathan led the way to the kitchen, where he prepared a simple dinner. "It's a bit more complicated than that. The Mustangs actually blocked our path deliberately. They were protecting a FO that had been poisoned by contaminated water." Grace's eyes widened with interest, her usual teenage reserve momentarily forgotten, deliberately, like they knew what they were doing. "That's what it looked like." Jonathan confirmed, serving the pasta he'd made. Darmir from the Wildlife Center was pretty amazed by their behavior. "To the Wildlife Conservation Center," Grace said, her camera bag down carefully on an empty chair. "I've been wanting to visit there. They're doing a study on the wild Mustang populations." Jonathan smiled, recognizing an opportunity. "I was thinking we might drive out there tomorrow. I want to check on that FO. And you could bring your camera." Grace's expression brightened. "Really? That would be amazing. I've been working on a photo series about wilderness spaces for my college portfolio." "I didn't know you were putting together a portfolio already." "Early applications," Grace explained, twirling pasta around her fork. "Environmental photojournalism programs." Our competitive pride swelled in Jonathan's chest. For all the distance between them, his daughter had grown into a focused, passionate young woman. "The Mustangs were incredible," he told her. "If they're still in the area tomorrow, you could get some unique shots." As they ate, Jonathan filled Grace in on the details of his extraordinary day, the herd's behavior, the contaminated spring, and Whitney's dismissive response. Grace listened intently, occasionally taking notes on her phone. "That's definitely chemical contamination," she said when he described the bluish sheen on the water, "probably heavy metals or mining byproducts. We studied this in AP Environmental Science. It's called acid mine drainage. You think Westridge is responsible?" Grace's expression grew. Serious, their new operation is using a process called open pit mining. It exposes rocks containing sulfides to air and water, creating sulfuric acid that leaches metals into the groundwater. They're supposed to have containment systems. But corners get cut when profits are at stake." Jonathan finished grimly. "Exactly." Grace hesitated, then added, "I did a research paper on them last semester. Their environmental record isn't great, Dad. They've had violations in 3 other states." Jonathan felt a twinge of guilt. He'd been transporting equipment for Westridge for years, without questioning what that equipment was being used for those kids in the hospital. "You think it's connected?" "Almost certainly," Grace replied with the confidence of youth. "Miller's Creek runs downhill from the mining site." "Right, same. Where's they stayed up later than planned." Grace showing him articles on her laptop about mining contamination and environmental regulations. When they finally turned in for the night, Jonathan lay awake thinking about Renegade and his herd, wild creatures who had somehow recognized a threat that humans had overlooked and had taken extraordinary action to draw attention to it. Morning arrived with a clarity unique to Wyoming summers. The air crisp, the sky impossibly blue. After breakfast, Jonathan and Grace drove out to the Wildlife Conservation Center, a modest facility nestled in the foothills about 20 miles outside of town. The center consisted of several low buildings surrounding a central courtyard with larger enclosures and rehabilitation pens spread out behind them. Dr. Maya met them at the entrance looking tired, but pleased to see them. "Jonathan, good timing. I was about to call you." "How's the FO?" Jonathan asked immediately, holding her own. The wildlife biologist replied, "We've named her." Hope seemed appropriate. He extended a hand to Grace. "You must be Jonathan's daughter. Jessica mentioned you're interested in environmental science." Grace nodded, shaking his hand. "Firmly environmental photojournalism. Specifically, is it okay if I take some pictures while we're here?" "Absolutely. In fact, we could use good documentation." He led them toward the back of the facility. "We've had quite a night." The FO wasn't our only patient in the large treatment room. They found Jessica administering fluids to a coyote that lay listlessly on an examination table. In separate enclosures around the room were two, Hawks, another coyote, and a young deer, all showing similar symptoms of lethargy and distress, all found near a contaminated watershed. Dr. Meyer explained grimly. The blood tests are still pending, but I bet my doctorate they're all suffering from the same toxicity. As the FO, where is she? Jonathan asked, looking around for the young Mustang. This way. They followed Dr. Meyer to a separate building with larger stalls, and one of them bedded down on clean straw lay the cream-colored FO. She lifted her head weakly as they approached, her large eyes dull with pain. But alert, a catheter was secured to her neck, delivering vital fluids and medications. She's a fighter, Dr. Meyer said with obvious affection. Responded well to the initial treatment. The big question now is whether there's been permanent organ damage. Grace had already raised her camera, capturing images of the FO with a professional focus that surprised Jonathan. She moved with quiet confidence, finding angles that showcased both the young whore's vulnerability and her resilience. What about the rest of the herd? Jonathan asked, watching as Grace worked. Sheriff Patterson reported they're still in the area. Though they move away from the contaminated spring, they've been spotted drinking from cleaner water sources further west. Smart, Jonathan murmured. Incredibly, so Dr. Meyer agreed. I've been studying Mustangs for 20 years, and I've never seen behavior like what you describe. Horses are intelligent social animals, but deliberately stopping a train to draw attention to a sick FO. He shook his head in amazement. A commotion at the front of the facility interrupted their conversation. Raised voices echoed down the hallway, one of them immediately recognizable as Sheriff Patterson's. That doesn't sound good. Dr. Meyer frowned, moving toward the disturbance. Jonathan and Grace followed in the reception area. Sheriff Patterson was engaged in a heated exchange with Victor Reyes, the regional environmental inspector, and a man Jonathan recognized as Carl Wilson, the sheriff's team's son, who worked for Westridge Mining. Need more than anecdotal evidence, Reyes was saying, his voice tired but firm. I understand your concerns, but I can't issue a stop work order based on one contaminated spring, 3 children in the hospital, and a wildlife whose center full of poisoned animals. Sheriff Patterson counted, his weathered face flushed with anger. How much more evidence do you need, Victor? Carl Wilson noticed their arrival first. Mr. Red. He acknowledged Jonathan with a nod, then glanced curiously at Grace. What's going on? Dr. Meyer asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. Victor Reyes sighed, rubbing his forehead. I've examined the spring site and taken samples. Yes, there's contamination, but we need lab results to confirm the source before taking any regulatory action. And those results will take how long? Jonathan asked. Minimum 2 weeks. Reyes admitted. 2 weeks. Grace burst out, unable to contain herself. That water is flowing downstream, right now, poisoning everything in its path. Carl Wilson's expression hardened. And Westridge employs 300 people in this county, young lady, people with families. To feed, we can't shut down a major operation on assumptions. They're not assumptions, Grace retorted, pulling out her phone. I have documentation of Westridge's environmental violations in Colorado, Montana, and Nevada. Same pattern, contaminated groundwater near open pit operations. Sheriff Patterson looked at Grace with newfound respect. You've done your homework. Carl seemed less impressed. Internet research isn't evidence of current violations. Westridge operates within all state and federal guidelines, and explained in this. Dr. Meyer interjected, leading them back to the treatment room where the sick animals lay, all found within a 5 millimeters radius of your operation, all with the same symptoms consistent with heavy metal poisoning. Victor Reyes examined the animals with genuine concern. This is troubling, certainly, but correlation isn't. Causation, there could be natural mineral deposits causing the contamination. Natural deposits don't suddenly start leaching into groundwater that's been clean for centuries. Grace argued something changed, and the only change in that watershed has been Westridge's new music operation. Jonathan watched his daughter with pride. Grace had always been passionate, but seeing her stand her ground against adults with such well-informed arguments showed him the woman she was becoming. Carl Wilson's radio crackled to life. He stepped away to answer, his expression changing as he listened to the message. When he returned, his face was grim. That was a hospital in Casper. He said quietly, one of those kids, Tyler Matthews, he's taken a turn for the worst. Kidney failure. The news landed like a physical blow. Tyler Matthews was only 15, a sophomore at Blue Mesa High. Jonathan had seen him around town, a lanky kid with an easy smile who bagged groceries at the local market on weekends. Sheriff Patterson's face aged 10 years in an instant. Victor, he said, his voice dangerously quiet, that boy might die because your agency won't act. Without crossing every T and dotting every I, Victor Reyes look genuinely conflict in my hands, are tied by the regulations, Lloyd, you know that, then untie them, Gray said fiercely. Sometimes doing what's right means breaking the rules. In uncomfortable silence followed her words, and unexpectedly Carl Wilson spoke up. There might be another way. He said slowly, I know where Westridge keeps their internal water testing records they do daily sampling at. Multiple sites, if those records show they were aware of contamination. His father stared at him in surprise. You'd risk your job. Carl glanced at the sick animals, then back at his father. I've got a kid, too, Dad. Tyler Matthews delivers our newspaper. Some things matter more than a paycheck. Hope flickered in Jonathan's chest. What do you need access to the records room at the main office? Carl replied. After hours. And someone who knows what they're looking for. All eyes turned to Grace, who straightened under their gaze. I can identify testing data for heavy metals and pH levels, she said confidently. I've studied the EPA's standards. Jonathan felt a surge of both pride and fear. It's too dangerous, he protested. If Whitney catches you, Dad, Grace interrupted gently. Those Mustangs stop your train. The protector, oh, can we do any less for Tyler Matthews, for our town? Jonathan looked around the room at the sick animals fighting for their lives, at Dr. Meir and Jessica, who had worked through the night to save them, at Sheriff Patterson, who's lined face showed the burden of protecting his community, at Carl Wilson, who was willing to risk his livelihood to do what was right, and at his daughter standing tall and determined, no longer the little girl he remembered, but a young woman of principle and courage. When do we start? He asked finally. Tonight, Carl answered. Security changes shifts at midnight. We'll have about an hour before the night patrol makes their rounds. As they began to plan, Jonathan's thoughts returned to the Palomino stallion and his herd. The Mustangs had recognized a threat to their home and had taken extraordinary action to address it. Now it was humanity's turn to follow their example. Outside the Sense windows, the vast Wyoming landscape stretched toward the horizon, its pristine beauty masking the invisible poison slowly spreading through its veins. Somewhere out there, Renegade and his Mustangs roamed free, unaware that their act of unlikely intervention had set in motion events that might just save not only their own kind, but the entire ecosystem they called home. The sun was setting as Jonathan and Grace drove back to town, casting long shadows across the golden prairie. Grass tomorrow would bring risks, but also the possibility of justice. For now, father and daughter shared a comfortable silence, united by purpose in a way they hadn't been for years. The Westridge Mining Administrative Building sat at the edge of Blue Mesa, a modern glass and steel structure that stood in stark contrast to the town's weathered storefronts and humble homes. By day, it projected corporate prosperity and power. By night, with only security lights illuminating its sleek facade, it looked almost predatory against the star-filled Wyoming sky. Jonathan parked his truck on a service road half a mile away, gutting the engine, and Lights Grace sat beside him in the passenger seat, dressed in dark clothing, her normally expressive face unusually serious. You're sure about this? Jonathan asked, not for the first time. Parental concern weared with his knowledge that they were running out of options. Grace nodded, checking her phone. Carl set to meet him at the maintenance entrance at 12:15. We have 10 minutes. The night was still and clear, the summer air cooling rapidly, as it always did in the high plains after sunset. They walked in silence, following a path along the property boundary that Carl had described. Jonathan couldn't help scanning the darkness for security patrols, every shadow suddenly suspicious. Dad, Grace whispered as they approached the building. If we get caught, we won't, he assured her, projecting a confidence he didn't entirely feel. But if we do, she persisted, don't let them pin this on Carl. It was our idea. Okay. Jonathan looked at his daughter with newfound respect. Her concern for someone she barely knew spoke volumes about her character. Deal. He agreed. The maintenance entrance was exactly where Carl had described, a nondescript door at the rear of the building, partially concealed by landscaping. Carl was already waiting, his tall frame tense with nervous energy. You made it, he whispered, relief evident in his voice. I was beginning to think you'd change your minds. Not a chance, Grace replied quietly. Did you get the key card? Carl held up a plastic badge. Maintenance supervisors won't be missed until morning. He swiped it through the reader, and the door unlocked with soft click. Remember, we have exactly 43 minutes before the night security guard makes his rounds to this section. They slipped inside, finding themselves in a dimly lit utility corridor. Carl led them through a maze of hallways, bypassing the main office area security. Cameras monitored the primary corridors, but Carl navigated them through staff-only passages where surveillance was minimal. The environmental compliance office is on the second floor, Carl explained as they approached the stairwell All the testing data should be in the filing cabinets or on the department. Computers, you seem to know a lot about where things are kept for someone in operations, Jonathan. Observed Carl's expression darkened. I worked in environmental compliance. My first year, asked too many questions, got transferred to second floor. Corridor was darker, illuminated only by emergency exit signs that cast an eerie red glow across the polished floors. Carl stopped outside a door, labeled Environmental Health and Safety. This is it. He whispered, swiping the badge again. The lock disengaged, and they enter a modest office with 4 desks arranged in the center and filing cabinets lining the walls. Grace immediately moved to the closest filing cabinet, scanning the labels. We need water quality reports from the Eagle Pass watershed dating back to before. They began the new operation that would establish baseline measurements. Those would be under pre-operation environmental impact studies. Carl suggested, pointing to a cabinet on the far wall. Recent testing data is probably on the computers, though. Jonathan stood guard near the door while Grace and Carl worked methodically through the files. The minutes ticked by with excruciating slowness. The only sounds a gentle rustling of papers and the occasional whispered consultation. Look at this, Grace said suddenly, her voice tight with controlled excitement. Water quality readings from 6 months ago, before the new pit was open, all within normal parameters for heavy metals. Carl joined her, examining the documents, and these are from last month. He added, pulling another file showing elevated levels of arsenic copper, and led in the same testing sites. They knew Grace breathed a face pale in the dim light. They had the data showing contamination, and they kept operating anyway. And readings, Carl said grimly, and internal memos showing they were aware of the problem. He moved to one of the computers, turning it on, and quickly bypassing the login screen with credentials he'd clearly prepared in advance. As Carl searched the digital files, Grace continued examining the paper records, organizing the most damning evidence into a separate stack. Jonathan remained by the door, every distant sound making him tense. They'd been in the office for nearly 25 minutes now. Time was running short. Got something, Carl announced in a hushed voice. Email exchange from last week between the site manager and Lawrence Whitney. They identified a containment issue at the eastern retention pond, but decided to defer repairs until a quarterly shutdown to avoid production delays. Grace leaned over his shoulder, reading quickly. That's the retention pond that feeds into the spring where we found FO. They knew it was leaking and did nothing. Can you forward those emails somewhere? Jonathan asked. Carl shook his head. Too easily traced, but I can print them. He sent the documents to a small desktop printer, which hummed quietly as it produced the evidence. Grace was photographing the most incriminating documents with her phone when they heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Too early for security patrol. Carl had warned about someone's coming. Jonathan whispered urgently, hide. Carl quickly shut down the computer. While Grace gathered the printed evidence, they ducked behind a row of filing cabinets. Just as the office door swung open, Lawrence Whitney himself stood in the doorway, his imposing figure silhouetted against the hallway lights. He wasn't alone. A man in a business suit that looked expensive even in the dim light stood beside him. I appreciate you meeting me so late, Senator, Whitney was saying, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet office. But I thought you should see these revised projections in person. I'm still not convinced, Lawrence, the other man replied, his voice carrying the polished inflections of someone accustomed to public speaking. The environmental concerns from your operation are becoming difficult to ignore. 3 children hospitalized, wildlife affected, unfortunate coincidences. Whitney dismissed with a wave of his hand. Nothing definitively linked to our operation. And remember, Westridge provides 300 jobs in a county that desperately needs them, not to mention our generous contributions to your re-election campaign. The Senator Jonathan recognized him now as Senator James Parker, their state's junior senator, sighed heavily. The EPA is sending a team to investigate, by which time we'll have addressed any minor containment issues, Whitney assured him smoothly. The important thing is that operations continue without interruption. The quarterly profit margins I'm about to show you should make clear why that's in everyone's best interest. They moved further into the office, Whitney heading directly for the desk that Carl had just been using. Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest. If Whitney noticed the war monitor or the recently accessed files, a phone rang. The senator's, judging by his annoyed expression as he checked the screen. I need to take this, he said. Give me a minute. As the senator stepped back into the hallway, Whitney turned his attention to the computer. His fingers moved across the keyboard, logging in with practiced ease. Jonathan held his breath, feeling Grace tense beside him. In their hiding place, Whitney frowned at something on the screen, then clicked through several menus. His expression darkened. Damn it, He muttered just loudly enough for them to hear. He picked up the desk phone, dialing an extension security. "Whitney here, I need you to check the access logs of the environmental office tonight." Yes, immediately. He hung up his movements sharp. With anger, the senator returned, slipping his phone into his pocket. "Problem, possibly Whitney," replied, his voice carefully controlled. "Someone may have accessed sensitive files. I've asked security to investigate. Perhaps this isn't the best time for our meeting," the senator suggested. Whitney forced her smile. "Nonsense. Let's use my office instead, more comfortable anyway." As they left, Whitney paused in the doorway, surveying the seemingly empty office with narrowed eyes before switching off the lights and closing the door behind him. The moment there, footsteps faded. Jonathan exhaled. "We need to get out of here. Now the security team will be checking the building." Carl whispered urgently, "We can't use the main exits. Is there another way out?" Grace asked, clutching the folder of evidence. Carl thought for a moment. The loading dock this time of night. It should be deserted. They slipped out of the office and moved quickly down the corridor in the opposite direction from Whitney and the center of the building. Seemed to have come alive with activity. Distant voices, the sound of doors opening and closing, the crackle of security. Radios. "They're sweeping the building," Carl murmured as they descended a service stairwell. "We don't have much time." The loading dock was on the ground floor of the rear of the building, a large open space where trucks delivered supplies during business hours. At night, it was cavernous and shadowy, illuminated only by safety lights. "There's a personnel door next to the main bay doors," Carl explained, leading them across the concrete. Floored, alarmed, but I can bypass it. They were halfway across the loading dock when floodlights suddenly blazed to life, bathing the space in harsh white light. A security guard stood by the control panel, his hand still on the switch. "Stop right there," he commanded, reaching for his radio. "Run." Jonathan shouted, grabbing Grace's arm and sprinting toward the exit Carl had indicated. Carl reached it first, frantically working to disable the alarm. The security guard was calling for backup, his voice echoing through the loading dock. Jonathan could hear more footsteps approaching from the corridor behind them. "Got it," Carl announced triumphantly as the door swung open. "Go." Grace darted through first, clutching the precious documents. Jonathan followed, turning back to make sure Carl was behind them. The security guard was closing and joined now by two others. "Carl, come on." Jonathan called. Carl hesitated at the doorway, glancing back at the approaching guards, then at Jonathan and Grace. "Get that evidence to my father." He said his decision, clear in his eyes. "I'll hold them off." Before Jonathan could protest, Carl slammed the door shut from inside, buying them precious seconds to escape into the darkness. "No," Grace cried, moving to go back. "We can't leave him. We have to." Jonathan said, the decision tearing at him. "He's giving us a chance to get this evidence out if we're all caught." It was for nothing they ran into the night, the sound of alarms now blaring behind them. Jonathan led the way back to where they'd left his truck, every shadow seeming to hide a pursuer. Only when they were safely inside the vehicle and speeding away did he allow himself to breathe. "We have to help Carl," Grace insisted, her face pale with worry. "They'll fire him, or worse, we will," Jonathan promised, "by getting that evidence to people who can use it." That's what he wanted. The drive to Sheriff Patterson's house took only 15 minutes, but it felt like hours. The modest home on the outskirts of town was dark, except for a single light in the kitchen. Jonathan pounded on the door, afraid the sheriff might have already gone to bed. Lloyd Patterson answered in a bathrobe, a coffee mug in his hand, his expression shifting from annoyance to concern when he saw their faces red. "What's happened?" Jonathan gestured for Grace to show him the documents, evidence that Westridge knew about the contamination and covered up. Carl helped us get it to be. Sheriff's eyes widened as he examined the papers. "Where's my son?" Now Jonathan's expression told the story before his words did. "He stayed behind so we could get away. Security caught us in the building." Patterson's weathered face hardened with a mixture of paternal fear and professional resolve. "Come inside, both of you." Once they were seated at his kitchen table, the sheriff examined the evidence more thoroughly, his expression growing grimmer with each page. "This is enough for a warrant," he said finally. "Clear proof they violated environmental regulations and knew about the contamination. Will it be enough to shut them down?" Grace asked anxiously. "With this plus the sick kids and animals?" Patterson nodded. "I'd say so, but Whitney has powerful friends. We need to move fast before he can cover his tracks, or before he does something to Carl." Jonathan added quietly, the sheriff's hand tightened around his coffee mug. "I'm calling Judge Hernandez right now. She can issue an emergency warrant even at this hour." He reached for his phone, then paused. "What you two did tonight was illegal, brave, but illegal, we understand," Jonathan said, meeting his gaze steadily. "Good." Patterson dialed the number. "Because if anyone asks, these documents were delivered anonymously to my mailbox. I never saw either of you tonight, understood?" They nodded in silent agreement. As the sheriff began explaining the situation to the judge on the other end of the line, Grace sagged against Jonathan's shoulder the adrenaline that had carried her through the night. Finally ebbing. "He'll be okay, right?" she whispered. Jonathan wished he could promise that everything would work out perfectly, but he'd learned long ago not to make promises. He couldn't keep "we've done everything we can," he said instead, putting his arm around her shoulders. "Now we have to trust Sheriff Patterson to do his job." Outside the window, the night sky was beginning to lighten, almost imperceptibly, the first hint of dawn approaching. In a few hours, blue Mesa would wake to a day unlike any other in its recent history, a day when the balance of power might finally shift away from Westridge mining and toward justice for the land and its inhabitants, both human and animal, and somewhere out in the vast Wyoming wilderness, Renegade and his herd of Mustangs continued their ancient way of life, unaware that their extraordinary act of intervention had set in motion events that might just save their home from destruction. Dawn broke over Blue Mesa with an intensity that seemed to match the day's impending drama. Sheriff Patterson had moved swiftly after obtaining the emergency warrant, assembling a team that included county deputies, 2 environmental enforcement officers who had arrived overnight, and Victor Reyes, the environmental inspector, who now looked both vindicated and apologetic. Jonathan and Grace watched from across the street as the law enforcement vehicles pulled up outside the West Ridge mining headquarters. They had gone home briefly to change clothes and grab coffee, but neither could bear to be anywhere else when the warrant was served. A small crowd of curious townspeople had begun to gather, as well word spreading through Blue Mesa's efficient small-town grapevine. "There's Carl," Grace said, suddenly nudging her father. Sure enough, Carl Wilson was emerging from the building, escorted by a security guard who looked considerably less than pleased. Sheriff Patterson intercepted them at the entrance, producing documentation that caused the guard to reluctantly step back. Father and son exchanged a brief word before Carl walked free, joining the law enforcement team entering the building. "He's okay," Jonathan breathed in relief. "For now," Grace cautioned. "Whitney isn't going to take this lying down." As if summoned by her words, a gleaming black Range Rover screeched to a halt in front of the building. Lawrence Whitney emerged, his normally immaculate appearance slightly disheveled, suggesting he dressed in haste. His face darkened to an alarming shade of red as he took in the scene before him. "This is outrageous," his voice carried across the street as he confronted Sheriff Patterson. "You have no right to enter my facility without I have every right." Patterson interrupted calmly, holding up the warrant. Judge Hernandez was quite clear about that. "Step aside, Mr. Whitney, or I'll have you arrested for obstruction." The threat of arrest seemed to penetrate Whitney's rage. He stepped back, though his eyes burned with fury, as he watched the officers enter his building. His gaze swept the growing crowd of onlookers, stopping when he spotted Jonathan and Grace. The look of pure hatred he directed at them sent a chill through Jonathan's spine. "We should go," he murmured to Grace. "There's nothing more we can do here. And Whitney clearly suspects us." Grace nodded reluctantly. "I'd like to check on Full anyway, see how she's doing." They were turning to leave when a familiar truck pulled up behind them. D.R. Meyer's white pickup with the Wildlife Conservation Center logo emblazoned on the door. The wildlife biologist leaned out the window, his expression urgent. "Jonathan, Grace, you need to come with me. The Mustangs are back at Contaminated Spring." Why would they return there?" Jonathan asked, hurrying over to the truck. "It's not just the Mustangs." Dr. Meyer explained it's something they found. "Jessica is already out there, but she says it's unlike anything she's ever seen. She asked specifically for you two." Jonathan and Grace exchanged a glance before climbing into Dr. Mear's truck. As they pulled away, Jonathan caught a final glimpse of Whitney, watching them leave. His cold eyes calculating the drive to Eagle Pass. Took less time than expected. Darmaya pushing his vehicle faster than usual along the rural roads. He filled them in as they traveled. Jessica was tracking the herd, documenting their movement patterns. After the incident, she noticed they returned to the original site this morning. When she approached to observe, she saw they were well. She said they were uncovering something. Uncovering what? Grace asked, her camera already in her hands. She wouldn't say over the radio. Darmir replied grimly, "Just that we needed to see it for ourselves, and that Jonathan should be there." They arrived at the service road nearest to the spring, parking beside Jessica's Jeep. The walk to the site was familiar to Jonathan now, though it felt different in the morning light. The landscape was alive with early activity, birds calling, insects buzzing, the scent of sage and dust heavy in the warming air. They heard the Mustangs before they saw them, soft nickering and the occasional stamp of hooves rounding a stand of juniper trees. They came upon a scene that immediately halted them in their tracks. The herd was gathered around Contaminated Spring. But they weren't drinking from it. Instead, several of the horses, led by Renegade, were actively pouring the ground around the water source, deliberately exposing. Something buried beneath Jessica stood at a respectful distance, documenting the behavior with a video camera. She waved them over her expression, a mixture of amazement and concern. "I've never seen anything like it." She whispered as they approached. They started at dawn, taking turns as coordinated, deliberate behavior. Jonathan watched in astonishment as Renegade stepped back, allowing another Mustang to continue the excavation. The Palomino stallion raised his head, seeming to notice the humans. For the first time, a soft whicker escaped him, almost like a greeting. What are they uncovering? Grace asked, raising her camera. To capture the extraordinary scene, look, Jessica pointed to where the Mustangs had been digging. See, that partially exposed in the disturbed earth was what appeared to be a large plastic pipe, industrial grade, at least 18 in diameter. It had been buried approximately 2 feet below the surface, its presence concealed by natural ground cover until the Mustangs had revealed it. "That's not supposed to be there," Dr. Mir stated, moving closer to examine it. "There's no permitted pipeline in this area." Jonathan's mind raced with the implications. Could Westridge have installed it secretly to divert contaminated water away from their testing sites? That would explain how they kept passing inspections. Jessica agreed. If they were channeling the worst of the runoff here, where it wouldn't be monitored, Grace was already photographing the exposed pipeline from multiple angles. "This is criminal," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "They deliberately piped toxic waste into wildlife habitat." "The question is," Dr. Meyer added, "how did the Mustangs know to uncover it? How did they make the connection between this pipe and contamination?" Jonathan watched Renegade, who had moved to stand directly between the humans and the exposed pipe almost as it presented his discovery. "I don't know," he admitted, "but they seem to understand cause and effect in a way I wouldn't have thought possible." Grace lowered her camera, her expression thoughtful. "Indigenous cultures have always recognized animal intelligence that Western science is only beginning to acknowledge. Maybe we've underestimated what they comprehend about their environment as they documented the illicit pipeline, taking soil samples and GPS coordinates. The Mustangs maintained their presence, sometimes continuing to expose more of the pipe's length, other times simply watching the humans work. "We should get this evidence to Sheriff Patterson immediately," Dr. Mir decided. After they had gathered comprehensive documentation, this pipeline alone is enough to shut Westridge down permanently. It's a flagrant violation of federal law. They were preparing to leave when the sound of approaching vehicles made them pause. 2 Westridge Company trucks were bouncing along the rough service road, moving with alarming speed. "That can't be good," Jessica murmured, instinctively moving closer to the Mustangs. A truck screeched to a halt nearby, and 4 men climbed out. Jonathan recognized Whitney's head of security, Frank Daniels, a former military man with a reputation for unquestioning loyalty to his employer. The others were Westridge workers, all wearing company uniforms and expressions that ranged from uncomfortable to openly hostile. "This is private property," Daniels announced without preamble. "You're trespassing. This is public land." Dr. Meyer, whom corrected firmly, "Bureau of Land Management territory, not Westridge property." Daniels smiled thinly. "The mineral rights belong to Westridge, and you interfere with company operations." His gaze shifted to the exposed pipeline, his expression hardening. "Step away from the equipment." Grace echoed incredulously. "You mean your illegal toxic waste pipeline?" Jonathan placed a warning hand on his daughter's shoulder, sensing the dangerous undercurrent in the confrontation. The Mustangs had grown alert. Renegade moving subtly to place himself between the newcomers and the rest of his herd. "We've already documented everything," Jonathan said calmly. "Sheriff Patterson has served a warrant on your offices. This morning your illegal operations are being shut down as we speak." A flash of uncertainty crossed Danielle's face, quickly replaced by determination. "Mr. Whitney instructed me to secure this site and remove any unauthorized installations. I suggest you leave immediately." "You mean destroy evidence?" Jessica translated her phone, visibly recording the confrontation. Daniels signaled to his men, who began unloading equipment from the trucks, shovels, a portable concrete mixer bags of quick setting cement. "They're going to bury it again?" Grace whispered in disbelief. "Literally cover up their crime." Dr. Meyer stepped forward. "This is a crime scene now. Tamper with evidence is a federal offense." "So is trespassing," Daniels replied smoothly. "Last warning, leave now, or we'll remove you." The standoff might have escalated further, if not for an unexpected intervention. Renegade, who had been watching the exchange intently, suddenly gave a loud, piercing neigh to signal the entire Mustang herd moved forward in unison, positioning themselves between the Westridge workers and the exposed pipeline. The workers faltered, clearly unnerved by the coordinated movement of so many. Large animals renegade, paw the ground aggressively as powerful muscles tense beneath his golden coat call them off. Daniels demanded, taking an involuntary step back. Jonathan almost laughed at the absurdity of the request. Their wild Mustangs, nobody controls them. What happened next occurred with such breathtaking speed that later, when Jonathan tried to recall the sequence of events, he found it difficult to separate one moment from the next. One of Daniel's men, perhaps panicking at the advancing horses, picked up a shovel and swung it threateningly.